Metro Exodus is one of the best single player shooters I've played in recent years. A game with incredible volumetric lighting and physics, all the while scaling well to all machines. The Google Stadia release then had me pretty excited. With 10.7 teraflops of GPU power on tap server side, developer Foundry Games has a chance to truly push Stadia beyond Xbox One X's visual quality. That's been the frontrunner up till this point after all, a native 4K rendition targeting 30 FPS and broadly using high settings from PC. Nothing is a given though. I mean, we have games like Destiny 2 taking a performance focused approach, pushing away from the console setup to run at a fluid 60 FPS. So how exactly has Stadia been used in Metro Exodus? And does Google's streaming tech complement a purely single player shooter? Let's find out. So let's cut to the chase. There's one thing I do respect about this version, the image quality. Firstly, kudos to Foundry Games for having the conviction to push a genuine 4K image from Stadia. It's a native 3840 by 2160 in every shot I've tested, really no small feat given the demanding nature of the engine. And while I can't 100% rule out dynamic res, it's been very consistent at that top number and I can't fault it. It's also a huge relief for me, having just come away from Final Fantasy 15 where, well, even on a 300 megabit per second connection, it's still technically only a native 1080p on Stadia. The 4K stream is only good for giving you a higher bitrate there. So yes, anyone running on a Chromecast Ultra looking to get the premier 4K presentation is in luck this time. Metro looks incredible on this. The payoff for a narrative-focused game like Metro Exodus is clear. From the pulse of specular highlights in those damp metro tunnels to the crisp, snowy overground, everything pops that much more. The story gets propelled to a greater height this way. Certainly much more so than, say, PS4 Pro's 1440p delivery. It puts Stadia essentially on the same level as Xbox One X. Sadly, there's no quality or performance modes at all in the settings. You just have options for motion blur intensity and that's about it. It's a one-size-fits-all approach which, again like Final Fantasy 15, means you've got to be on board with the developer's choices. On the surface, this is well pitched though. In a multiplayer FPS, yes, it may have been a better priority to aim for a higher frame rate, seeing as we're stuck at 30 FPS here. But in this case, it works. You can expect a supremely sharp presentation all round.
I can't believe my eyes. Artyom, you're alright. You give us
One factor that does hold Stadia back from Xbox One X is the encoding quality. It's inevitable really. Generally speaking, the streaming is top notch in most games when it works, but Metro Exodus is unique by design. It takes on a much darker colour palette than most titles, lots of trawling through dark spaces, in other words, caves, ducts and underground bases. And the blunt truth is that as a result, the darker points of the image show more compression artifacts. Google's encoder works to minimize the size of each frame by pruning back quality on low contrast areas, which makes sense. The black detail here though, well, it can show up with macro blocking, creating obvious bands in between points of shade. And in comparison with X, it does start to undo the positives of rendering at 4K. It's nothing against the game itself. Metro Exodus looks as great as ever. It's simply producing a type of video content that doesn't always compress easily. Equally, the use of snow particles and potentially film grain gives the encoder more challenges even in the light of day. There's a lot of per pixel detail being added in post. It's not a deal breaker at all, but shows up more readily than most other games I've tried. With that being said though, the core settings used on Stadia hold up really well. Check out these side by sides with Xbox One X and see if you can spot any major difference outside of compression. Besides the variable cloud coverage, they're nigh on identical in every other respect. From the 4K image down to the use of screen space reflections, Stadia is a match for X. Even shadows and textures are the same. Now I'm keeping the default high motion blur setting. Again, it's a really nicely executed effect that beds in the action nicely, and at least we have the option to turn it off if we don't like it. Everything here appears to pair up with PC's high preset, nothing more or less. In a way, that's a shame given the right potential for more. Stadia is on paper the more powerful machine of the two, purely in specs, a 6 teraflop machine versus a 10.7 teraflop one. And yet that doesn't come across in the visual parity we're getting here. It's great to see 4K, certainly, but PC features like ray tracing for shadows or even tessellation would have been the next step. In our PC analysis, we saw some great use of tessellated brickwork. That didn't make the grade on console, and well, it's not made it to Stadia either. Another area that I expected to see a more radical upheaval in is loading times. Just looking at Stadia on its own, Metro takes around a minute to load each area from the world map. It's part of this very modular design that 4A Games has gone for, in splitting the story across different regions. But with that comes these really long waits. It was a bother on console too, in fairness. Based on other games, Stadia has much improved media access speeds, and it worked out faster in loading Final Fantasy 15 for example. But here, it's still far from ideal. You do get a moment to fill in the narrative blanks, and it is better than Xbox One X at least, but overall it's not quite problem solved. There's a final point here on performance. Everything so far points to an Xbox One X-like experience on Stadia, which is great, but only if the frame rate can hold, and you'd assume it would. More power on tap and equivalent settings to a less powerful machine should translate to a stable 30 FPS. And yet that's somehow not translated across. So let's kick off with Stadia. Now, excuse the hiccups and stutters, my network had a little trouble towards the start of the game with intermittent hitching, which cleared up as I went. That's connected to the Chromecast Ultra's Ethernet port on a fiber connection. Google's service describes the connection as excellent at least, and we're prioritizing best visuals here. So just about everything is the best case. How's it looking then? Well, frame pacing is clearly an issue. Note those tiny spikes up to 16 milliseconds and down to 50. Either way, it's pretty regular and clearly there's an issue with the frame rate cap at 30 FPS. On top of the stutters, it makes the game feel less smooth than it should do. But on balance and overlooking that, it does generally stabilize at 30 FPS for a bulk of play on Stadia. That is, with some key exceptions as we near lots of smoke effects. The first bit of bad news here is Stadia's performance is worse than Xbox One X. Take this shootout as an example, where Stadia starts plummeting to the mid-20s. It's that deadly combination of lighting and fog and all those alpha transparencies that does it. We saw similar on base PS4 and Xbox One, but for a console way ahead in its reported GPU power, it's surprising we're not a locked 30 here. Worse still, anything to do with full screen transparencies has issues, like this early encounter. We're dipping just under 20 FPS. Add in the stuttering and frame pacing troubles and it doesn't feel as well optimized as it should be. The obvious comparison point again is Xbox One X. This is freshly captured footage on the latest patch, and in every one of those problem areas, it's more or less a straight 30 FPS on X. The only exception is really that early tussle with the mutant, with the flames and webs and so on. At least there, it's dropping just under 30 with tearing. It's very rare to see a drop on the whole though, and even the fog effect doesn't really buckle the machine. All of which is very strange, given the settings are so close between the two. There's no clear reason why it's happening, but Stadia right now seems to have bigger issues holding 30 FPS. It's also worth noting at this point that input lag in Metro Exodus is noticeably on the high side. Anecdotally speaking, adding around 44 milliseconds of latency to a game which already had issues with input lag does it no favours. You'll have noticed I'm kind of struggling to aim quickly here, more so than other shooters on the service. It's a challenge. Some games translate to a streaming platform better than others. RPGs and adventure titles with a fixed camera tend to work better. Here though, as a shooter, the disconnect between the controller and the reaction is far more noticeable. Metro Exodus on Stadia targets the premier visual experience rather than anything else. 3840 by 2160 at around high settings is impressive stuff, at least, if not everything I'd entirely hoped for. What that costs in performance though isn't what I expected. Sub 30 FPS reading should be a thing of the past, but drops do creep in during major set pieces. No doubt, it's a gorgeously presented game, and there's an argument here that you might want to stick this on the easier difficulty settings just to enjoy the story. It's also a step up from the support Final Fantasy 15 received, though again I'm finding the quoted specs of Stadia aren't getting us a big enough lead over the competition as I'd expected. A solid addition to the Stadia library then if you fancy a purely solo FPS, but not without its flaws. But for me, that's all I've got today. If you did find this video useful or insightful in any way, please let me know by liking or subscribing, and don't forget to hit the bell to get notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality pristine version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch with me or the team, just use Twitter. But from me for now, thanks for watching.
Stop the engine immediately and come out with your hands above your head.